Okay, sorry about that. Had a student walk in about 23 minutes into making this video, and rather than just starting over and making the video again, I'm just going to try to pick up where I left off. Left off talking about the Sinaloa cartel and El Chapo, who escaped from Mexican prison in 2001. Has more recently waged war with the Juarez cartel in Nuevo Laredo. He has his own little enforcer group similar to Los Zetas, known as the Los Negros, led by Edgar La Barbe Valdez Villarreal, a man who was believed to have recently led an attack on the Nuevo Laredo police in an attempt to take control of the police away from Los Zetas. And much like one of the other cartels, the Sinaloa frequently uses alliances with other cartels, particularly in their war against Los Zetas and the Juarez cartel. Now, the our fourth and last of the major cartels is the aforementioned Juarez cartel, led by Amado Carrillo Fuentes. Fuentes was raised in the Sinaloa province in the 1950s, learned the drug trade from his uncle, and was a former director of federal security with the Mexican Federal Police. In the mid-'80s, Fuentes partnered with the Cali, the Cali Colombian cartel for trafficking drugs, and Amado took control of the Juarez cartel in the mid-'80s and did it, and he is more like traditional organized crime leaders than the leaders of, say, the other three of the major cartels, and that his rise to power was not just about violence, and it certainly was. I mean, he was responsible for the murder of hundreds of people who opposed him, but he also built up his control by keeping public officials in his pocket, which the corruption, again, that's not standard for the cartels. But unlike the other cartels, the other three cartels, they tend to rule by fear, through intimidation, through violence, and while Fuentes does a bit of that, he also worked, because he was familiar with the Colombian, particularly the Cali's methods. Fuentes worked very hard on building a Pablo Escobar type image with the public, tried to set himself up where people would perceive him as a benefactor to the people, and so very similar to what some of the Sicilian mobsters back in the old country would do. He also is the Juarez cartel, also very big in using technology to give them an edge. Unfortunately for Fuentes, he died in 1997 during a facial reconstruction. This is a smart guy. He used a lot of technology, understood the importance of his public image, but in 1997, he really felt like the DEA was closing in on him, and so he arranged for plastic surgery, for facial reconstruction, and ended up dying on the operating table. Unfortunately for the rest of Mexico, Armando's brother Vicente Carrillo Fuentes took over for him and just pretty much picked up where he left off. The Juarez cartel, they're kind of unique in that they use a cell-like structure, similar to terrorist groups, and they are heavily involved in money laundering. Let's see, where do I want us to go? Let's see. Beyond just talking about the four cartels, I'd also like to talk a little bit about combating Mexican drug trafficking organizations. And then, the combating against DTOs comes in three different flavors or or forms. There are multinational efforts through the United Nations, attempts to combat the Mexican DTOs, other type of trafficking. Unfortunately, that is focused almost solely on drug interdiction and punishment, and so they're not the most successful of methods. There is a lot of cooperation. The second tier of methods for combating the Mexican DTOs is cooperation between the United States and Mexico, and there is quite a history of that. The U.S. and the United States and Mexico has cooperated against DTO. Their cooperation goes back to the 1960s, particularly to Operation Cooperate in 1969. What a clever and imaginative name, right? Operation Cooperate. Followed up in 1975 by Operation Condor. I believe you can read about Operation Condor in your textbook. In the 80s and 90s, we saw a lot of tension. We saw a decrease in cooperation between Mexican and U.S. officials, mostly based around corruption in the Mexican government, but not just all. Can't blame it all on the Mexicans. A lot of it has to do with illegal action by U.S. government officials that the Mexicans believe that are some of our drug agencies violated Mexico's sovereignty. Disagreement over our border practices, things about like our DEA kidnapping Mexicans, going into Mexico, kidnapping Mexican nationals and bringing them across the border, or hiring bounty hunters to do that for us, create a lot of tension, saw a lot of decrease in cooperation between Mexico and the United States. And then a lot of our border policies right after 9/11 added to the tension. But the relationships in recent years have been getting better, especially thanks to President Bush, second President Bush, George W. His administration, beginning in 2007, really laid the groundwork for a regional security plan, not just in Mexico, but in all of Central America, involved not just controlling immigration, but combating the drug lords and the arms smuggling. Probably the big highlight of that was the Meridia Initiative. This was a 3-year agreement between the Bush administration, between the United States and Mexico, for the United States to provide financial material support to the Mexican Army and Mexican government for combating, for helping provide for Mexican security. In 2008, we sent our first installment of that plan, about $400 million, to Mexico. And while President Obama has kind of dragged his feet on continuing that payment, it does appear that the Obama administration is committed towards helping reduce violence along the U.S.-Mexican border, at least as much as we are willing to do. The third tier of efforts to combat the DTOs comes in the form of internal efforts by Mexico itself, but there are limitations there, particularly among the local police. And Mexican, I told you a little bit about when President Fox or when President Calderon took over, you saw a lot of local Mexican police being suspended and taken out of the way, and federales being brought in to take their place. And the reality is that may have been a necessary move by the Mexican government, because local Mexican police have some severe limitations, starting with some limited educational development. Secondly, they are very poorly paid, which makes them very vulnerable to corruption. Interestingly enough, local Mexican police are not authorized to receive crime reports from citizens. And then, in addition to that, and the poor training and limited educational development, they are untrained in crime scene investigation, to the point that they are largely untrained in how to preserve evidence at a crime scene. So not only can they not do the crime scene, the local police cannot do the crime scene investigation themselves, they're not even trained on how to secure crime scene and preserve evidence for federal police that might be trained to come in later. All of these reasons led to President Calderon's decision to supplement or to supplant local Mexican police with military law enforcement. In addition to those reasons, the reality is Mexican people have a little more confidence in their military. And by the mid-90s, more than half of the 32 Mexican states had military personnel in charge of their law enforcement. Was this a successful thing? Was this a good idea? I'm not sure, because the longer this goes on, the more corruption has been seeping into the federal police. And the reality is, military is not really the appropriate solution when it comes to law enforcement. Soldiers are not trained, except for law enforcement specialists in the military. Law enforcement's not really trained, military soldiers are not trained in law enforcement, which causes an increase in human rights violations. And like I said, corruption does seep into the military over time. Hence we get things like Rosetas. I really ought to get Diet Coke to pay me for those nice product placements for them. So that's Mexico. I guess I do want to talk a little bit about the rest of Central America. Because what about Central America's role in the drug trade? In previous units we've talked about the major Colombian cartels. We've now talked about the Mexican DTOs. What about the rest of Central America, as sometimes forgotten countries between Mexico and South America? Central America's role in drug trafficking largely is relegated to transportation for groups in South America, especially Colombia, Bolivia, and Peru. And then the bulk of that trafficking tended to go through Honduras, particularly under a family-run Honduran group run by a man named Juan Ramos Mata Balestros. He made the first connections between the Medellin cartel and the Guadalajara Mexican cartel. And of course, this was before there are more than just the 4 DTOs that I talked about. In 1985, he was implicated in the murder of a DEA agent named Enrique Camara. He went on the run, and when Ballesteros went on the run in 85, it opened the door for other trafficking groups. And so we see now trafficking from South America to Mexico does not just go through Honduras, but now also goes through Nicaragua and Panama. The end of the Medellin cartel and the Cali cartels in Mexico resulted in an increase in coca production and focused it into Colombia. So we see Bolivian and Peruvian drugs kind of fall off. And we see a lot of this production being done on the border, particularly the Colombian border with Ecuador, Venezuela, and Panama. In the place of the big cartels in Colombia, we see a lot of paramilitary groups. 3 in particular I would mention would be the Autodefensas Unidas de Colombia, or the AUC. This was probably the largest of these paramilitary groups, formed in the 1990s. Formed nominally to fight leftist guerrillas. They had up to 35,000 soldiers as part of their group, led by a man named Diego Murillo, a.k.a. Don Berna, who was a former Medellin cartel hitman. At the same time, there were some Colombian police in the Cali area, formed their own DTO or their own group called Norte de Valle, and then they were going to get based on Cali. And then finally there's a guerrilla front, the guerrilla front from the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Colombia, or FARC, F-A-R-C, which became involved in production and supply of cocaine. All of these organizations, and the other smaller ones, that sprung up with the fall of the Cali and the Medellin cartels, use Central American nations as their transport routes up into Mexico and the United States. Particularly, they would run through Honduras. In 2003, now 2003 was a big spectacular year for change. 2003 saw the Norte de Valle cartel had a bloody internal conflict that damaged their ability for trafficking and producing drugs out of Colombia. At the same time, the AUC demilitarized, and most of their leaders turned themselves in, which was probably encouraged by the Colombian government that began a military offensive against the guerrilla groups. This led to a power struggle within the Mexican DTOs, who began negotiating with the coca producers in Colombia themselves. And so what's left in Colombia is largely the Mexican DTOs working directly with the coca producers in Colombia and then transporting their drugs through Central America. You have a few small groups operating still in Colombia that also do some transportation through Central America. As of 2010, there were really 4 remaining trafficking organizations, all of which have associations with Mexican DTOs and do their trafficking through Honduras and Nicaragua or Panama. The first is Rastrojas, Rastrojas, led by former Norte de Valle and AUC leaders. They operate along the Pacific coast and the Venezuelan border, and they are partners with the Sinaloa and Juarez cartels. There is Urabeños, more remnants of the AUC. They operate along the Panamanian border and are partnered with the Gulf Cartel. There are a few groups still left of the FARC, which is the only the original ones left. This front of the FARC operating along the border with Ecuador, Venezuela, Panama. They are partnered with the Tijuana and Juarez cartels. And then there is Los Paisas, third-generation Medellin DTO, who work with the Beltran League organizations, and not working with one of the major DTOs. So what's left for Central America? They're not big players. In Central America, most of the drug trade is small family organizations, either out of Guatemala or Honduras. Out of Guatemala, there are 3 primary families: the Mendozas, the Lorenzetes, and the Loenes. Out of Honduras, there is one big family, which is run by Nelson Javier Riviera. And all of these guys really are transporters for these big groups in Colombia, or these small groups in Colombia, these big DTOs in Mexico. But they also get into some local distribution. And I think for Latin American crime, as Forrest Gump says, that's all I've got to say about that.